Here, me.
Living in the new world with an whole soul.
This is Giants Amongst Us.
Now, here's a little story I got to tell.
What's up? How's everybody doing? I hope you all are in good spirits. Welcome back to the show. Thank you for tuning in. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are at this point in time. So we're back from our break, and we've got another one. Real stories told by real people. And today, Emmanuel joins us, and he's got a story to tell. Imagine growing up in a cult and being kept away from your biological father, bouncing from place to place with the mother who was abusive, and as a child, when you try to speak out and look for some kind of support or help, the authorities, school board members, all they give you is a cold shoulder. They look at you in disbelief. Your words fall on deaf ears. How alone would a child feel to be ignored like that? How that could damage and affect and just kill the spirit of a kid. This was Emmanuel's reality at a young age, and at 15 years old, he left, feeling that there was nothing else he can do but just get up and go. At 15 years old, left to fend for himself. I'd like to give you all a warning, too, that this episode will have some sensitive topics being discussed. Sexual abuse is one of them. Life is a journey. It's a hell of a ride. In Emmanuel's story, it has pain, it has suffering, it has trauma, there's abuse. But to anybody that has listened to this podcast and this show, you know that it doesn't end there. And Emmanuel's story is no different, because he talks about growth, he talks about love, he talks about forgiveness, he talks about healing. And that's the essence of this podcast. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, this is Emmanuel and his story. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in. We've got another show. We have another story. And today we're joined by Emmanuel. I probably said it wrong again. We were trying to get it right beforehand, but I gave it a shot. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day. You could have been doing anything. You could have been anywhere. It pretty much was a spur of the moment. Thank you so much for being with us today. So welcome.
Well, thank you. I always I use any opportunity to tell my story. I think it's important, and I love your angle of having a positive impact on people and people being able to take something away from other people's experiences.
Absolutely. So for starters, can you share with us a little bit about where you come from and how it was for you growing up?
Oh dear, yeah. If you ask me that kind of question, that already kind of
That opens up a can of worms.
yeah, that already gets into the whole issue because I didn't have a typical childhood like at all.
And we're talking about out of the womb directly.
In my case, pretty much, yeah. It's all kind of related, and it starts with my birth, pretty much, yeah. That whole thing is also um related to everything,
Right.
but I'll get into that later. So I don't know where I should start.
Well, how about like let's, because you do have a unique upbringing. If and we talked a little bit offline, so I kind of have a small backstory, but I'm sure there is so much more. But for starters, I guess, did you grow up in a large family or was it a small family?
My actual family was very very small, because like I said, sometimes my mother was living in communes together with me, so in that sense that was my family. But my actual family was only my mother. That's why I said it starts with my birth, because I was born. I'm German, but I wasn't born in Germany, and I lived all over the place, and that was mainly because my mother didn't want my father to be able to see me. So that's why I was born in a different country, and that's why we always moved different places, and that's why it's difficult to talk about my childhood.
Out of curiosity, how old was your mother when she had you?
28. And I was, in a way, I was her second child, but I was her only child. But in a way, and then, I was her second child in the sense that before she had me, she had an abortion. So, and she didn't want to have that abortion. It was her father and her boyfriend that pressured her into having an abortion. And
Mm-hmm.
that traumatized her. She felt guilty, even though it wasn't her fault. There was nothing to feel guilty about, uh, as far as I'm concerned. If she was pressured into doing that, it's not her fault, right? But she felt guilty anyway, and so she was looking for a way to make up for that, and she figured, well, if she just has another child and doesn't abort it this time, she can make up for having aborted the first one. And so she just kind of picked up my father in some bar, just it was just like the first dude she met, and she threw herself at him,
Mm-hmm.
just to have the child. And after she was pregnant, he served his purpose. She didn't like man because of her own negative experiences with men and having been forced to have the abortion and stuff like that. So yeah, so that's how all that came about.
And then, like you were telling me a little bit beforehand, you were born into what you would call a cult, right?
I wasn't exactly born into it. That's actually a good question, because it might actually all have started with my birth, but I don't know for certain. I just noticed something, when I looked into some of the teachings again. I mean, I know the teachings of that religious group. Obviously I still know them from my childhood, but now in preparation I looked at it again a little bit, and I noticed that one of the gods, or one of the divine beings, divine beings is a better word. One of the divine beings they believe in is actually called Emmanuel. So it's
Mm-hmm.
actually, it's my name. I figured I never noticed that before. I never saw that before. But did my mother give me that name because that religious group believes in that being as a divine being? They have a divine being called Emmanuel. I never thought about that before. I never realized that before, but I think my mother actually intentionally gave me that name because of that. And I never knew for certain if she was already in contact with that religious group when I was born, but I think she must have been, yes.
And you were moving around. You said, as far as you can remember, you were moving mainly to stay away from your father.
Right, right.
So if you're moving around the way you were, I could only imagine that you weren't able to go to a regular school,
No,
with
no, no. Okay, well, so first off, well, when I was very young, she was moving around a lot. And then there were, it was a period of time, a couple of years, where she settled in that area of the religious group, and where we were living on the property of that religious group. And that lasted the longest. That was the longest time we stayed in one place, because we stayed in that place for I don't know, maybe like 7 or 8 years, which was very long. It was the longest time in my childhood that we stayed in one place. And other than that,
hmm
it was all just moving from one place to another, usually within a couple of months.
Can you, for that 7 year period? I mean, you don't have to get into everything, but can you kind of give us an idea of how it was being involved in that community?
Yeah. Well. in a way, it was. I mean, it's a very. I mean, we can use names. um, it's called. Well, in English, it would be called universal life. In German, it's called universelles Leben. It's a German Christian, or at least they call themselves Christian, new religious movement. You know, as you're supposed to say nowadays instead of cult.
Yeah. Is that the new
Just kidding.
word?
I'm just kidding.
Is
I'm
that
just kidding.
yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's the PC term, right? It's a Christian new religious movement, and actually, it has some Gnostic elements to it as well. But I didn't notice that as a child. As a child, I had no idea what Gnosticism even was. It's just recently that I learned, some aspects of Gnosticism, and I realized, hey, that group like 20 years ago, that was like total Gnostic. And of course, as a child, I didn't
Yes.
notice that. So it's a Christian neo Gnostic sect that was at the time was very popular here in that area. So I live in Bavaria, and one city in particular where they were very popular back then. But outside of that, they're probably not as well known. But still, I think it's still relevant because the way they operate and the way all of that happens is maybe pretty typical, and a lot of similar groups probably operate very similarly. So I imagine that even if people don't know that specific group, they might know a group like that.
When it was that time, the 7 years, how old were you? Well, how old were you during that time?
Yeah, so at the time when she was really starting to get serious with that group, I mean, she had always read their books, and that's probably why she gave me that name, because at that time she was already reading their books, and then she was in a place where they had a small community. You want me to mention the German city names?
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so we were living in Regensburg,
Okay.
another city in Bavaria,
Uh-huh.
where they had a small community, and she was very involved in that small community there. But she felt she wanted to go to the big community, which is in Würzburg. So then we moved to Würzburg so that she could live. Because the properties, they have a lot of properties, both now and back then. They own a lot of buildings around here, a lot of farms around here, a lot of compounds, basically. Yeah, so a lot of real estate. They have a lot of real estate. And so she moved here to live, on one of their farms, and basically dedicate her whole life to them and work with them, work for them. It was like a bit like a communist commune in a sense. Everyone was working together, and there wasn't really a concept of money. Everyone was kind of sharing everything. I don't think they do that anymore. Little disclaimer in case someone from that group listens to that and maybe gets offended and says, "Oh, that's not how it is." I don't think they do that anymore now. That whole commune aspect. I don't think they have that anymore. But back then, they were emphasizing that a lot.
When was this? What year? Around what year was this?
I think it was in. It all really started in 1988. I mean, at least for my mother, right? So I think in 1988 is when. I mean, she was already before 1988. She was already involved with a small community in Regensburg. Around 1988, she moved to Würzburg, and that's when she dragged me into it. But your question was how old I was. So how old would I have been? Yeah, it started when I was around 5 years old. That's when she really dragged me into it as well.
Wow, 5 years old. So now your mother at this time dedicated herself to these group of people, and she pretty much was devoting her whole lifestyle was a part of building or serving this sector. Now she was already an adult, but what was it like for a child? Like what kind were you also put on the farm? Were you sent through classes? Were they like indoctrinating you through books or lectures and things like that?
So later on, that was when I was already out, right? But then they started to really have schools and to really focus on children. But back then they didn't. So back then they didn't have schools of their own, and they didn't really target children yet. So that the whole back then, the whole doctrine and all the teachings were focused on adults. I didn't I didn't really care for that at all, because it didn't speak to me. At that time they were really focused on targeting adults that were disappointed with the Catholic Church, because in this area, I mean, it's not the case anymore. Now they're all atheists. Now almost everyone in Germany is basically an atheist, even if they say they're not atheists. Trust me, they're atheists. Well, anyway, most Germans are atheists now, but back then, at least in that area, everyone was Catholic, and back then everyone genuinely believed in God. At least at that time, they still kind of did. So they were targeting these kinds of people, who truly believed in God, but who were disappointed with the Catholic Church, because obviously, if you're a Christian, if you read the Bible, you'll discover some discrepancies between how Jesus acted and how the Catholic Church and the Pope acts, right? So they were targeting these kinds of people, and was very effective, but it meant nothing to me as a child.
How did they occupy the time of kids? Like, what were they doing? Did you guys have like sports that they put you in, or the activities that they?
They didn't have any official programs for children at that time. They didn't have them yet. Like I said, later on they started focusing heavily on children, but at that time they didn't do that yet. So they didn't have any programs for children yet. The extent of their programs for children was like, in a way, it's a little similar to Islam, or maybe to Mormons, in the way that they have their own prophet. In this case, a woman. They say they're Christian, but and they say they believe in the Bible, but in reality, they kind of really don't. What they truly believe in is these revelations by their what's the female form of prophet?
Prophetess.
Right, by their prophetess. Okay, so that's what they truly believe in. So every once in a while, back then, the prophetess would still come out with new revelations, so to say. And that was like a big event, and everyone was going there. Even though you never saw her in person, it was always on tape. Right? So, yeah, so those events were big, and my mother, of course, always went there to hear the newest revelation. And of course she dragged me along, and of course I didn't know what to do during that time, so they started arranging, like they would have like a big conference room where the prophetess on tape would give her newest revelation, and then in the next room they would organize a little room for the children to play. So that was the extent of their programs for children back then. So and the rest of the time, since we were living on their compound anyway, of course I was living with them, and everyone. I kind of liked it because they were kind of friendly. I mean, at least to me as a child, right? So it was kind of, in a way, it was kind of fun, and I was helping with the farming and helping with some of the chores, and so that was kind of fun. Like with my mother, because I was always only around my mother, so it was kind of nice to also have some other people to be around with. So for me, that aspect was actually kind of nice. Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I was trying to understand. Like, even if they didn't have any kind of programs for the kids, but what were you doing at that time? Your mother and people there, were they even allowed to leave? Like, say if they wanted to go visit family outside the compound, how was that looked at, or how was that dealt with?
Obviously, I mean that wasn't specified in their teachings, right? But obviously, if you have a group like that, obviously, because it's just human psychology, right? It's just human psychology. So
Hmm.
gradually, automatically, because these people bond together, right? They're going there not necessarily because they truly believe all the spiritual teachings, but also a big aspect is because of the community. They're looking for a community, and they're looking for other people, to give them a purpose in life, and to have a bond with, and stuff like that. So automatically, if you're in such an environment, and if it's very intense, then
Yeah.
increasingly, automatically, these people will, with the passage of time, start to more and more demonize the outside world in a way. Uh, and that's also a big aspect for why I didn't go to school most of the time. So most of the time I wasn't in kindergarten, and I didn't go to school because my mother wouldn't let me. Even though in Germany, there's no such thing as being homeschooled in Germany. In Germany, by law, you have to go to school. But since they didn't have schools of their own, and since public schools were kind of demonized, I just simply didn't go to school, and I didn't. My mother didn't let me to go to school anyway.
Hmm.
Even independently from that group, she didn't really want me to go to school in any case. So if we weren't at that compound, then most of the time I would just have my mother. At that compound, at least I had contact with these other people there, right?
Yeah. How was the relationship with your mother during that time?
The relationship with my mother was always very difficult. Uh, it was never easy because there's so many issues. I don't know if you have time to get into all of it, but let's just say it was always difficult. And maybe you can kind of understand uh, why that might be difficult in such a situation. Yeah.
And for as long as you can remember, has it been that way?
Mm, it was. I mean, I'm not saying that's because of the group, but it was always difficult for me. I never had a normal childhood, no, and so eventually I ran away. I left the group, and I left my mother. Like we were talking about, when before we started, that ties into some of the more difficult and serious aspects, and that's that I was abused, even sexually abused. So that's why I ran away, and it wasn't because it wasn't the people in the religious group that abused me. Well, it was obviously, since my mother was part of that religious group. But anyway, no, it wasn't the people in the religious group that abused me. It was my mother that actually sexually abused me. So that was obviously the most difficult for me, and that's why it was never easy for me in my childhood, especially when I was still around my mother. No matter if she was in that religious group or not, obviously it was always difficult for me to be around my mother. That's why I eventually ran away from my mother. Because normally you'd have like child protective services or something helping you, and that's also why my mother moved around so much. It's to avoid the authorities, right? And she was pretty good at avoiding the authorities and staying off grid. Other than in such communes, but these communes, at least back then, were off grid themselves. So she always kind of stayed off grid. So there weren't as many outsiders around to help me. And even if I did manage to talk to someone, or I even tried to talk with the police, but back then it was just people couldn't believe that they believed me. I remember talking to the police, and they believed me up to the point where it became clear that the allegations of sexual abuse were not against my mother, but no, the other way around. We're not against my father, but against my mother, and they couldn't imagine that. They couldn't imagine that my mother would do that, or that a woman would do that. So they simply didn't believe me. So in the end, I didn't see any other way than to run away.
That's just a damn shame that a lot of people's voices are left unheard. How about like during the abuse while you were in these communities, was there ever anybody around that seen or had a feeling about something going on?
That's difficult. I don't. Well, on the one hand, I don't want to say anything wrong. I don't want to accuse that group of something it didn't do. On the one hand, and on the other hand, I honestly, I really don't know. I was, well,
I only reason I asked that is because it seems like there's times that people are in the presence of something like that, but for whatever reason, they turn away from it. They don't want to get involved in it.
yeah. That was the attitude of everyone back then. So it wasn't just the people in that religious group. It was everyone that saw that. I mean, most people that had contact with me or my mother saw that there was something off going on, but most of them had just kind of had the attitude of looking the other way. And like I said, back then people just couldn't imagine that a woman would do something like that. If it was the father, was something different, but with a woman, they couldn't imagine that. It was kind of the attitude people had back then. I don't know.
So you were getting that not just from the local authorities, from everybody.
I was getting that from everyone. That's my point. I was getting that from everyone.
Right. From not just the local authorities, but from anybody and everybody that was around and didn't say anything. And it's like a lot of times, you hear of these stories, and it's like, oh, if I would have known, and there was so many red flags, but things go left undone, and especially at a young age when usually a child, you're seeking protection, you're seeking support from the adult. And in that sense, it seemed like you're surrounded by people, but it's like, I can't trust any of them. And there's really nowhere to go for the support that I'm looking for because it seems like nobody's listening and nobody cares. How were you at that time? I'm sure you were inside. You were all mixed up.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I think the real reason, and of course I don't know that for sure. It's just my impression. If you're looking for an answer of why people behave like that. See, and it doesn't matter if it's that religious group or it was like that with other groups as well. No matter where we were, and even if there was at least a short period of time where my mother actually, eventually she realized, okay, I need some schooling, right? So eventually she did send me to school. So it's not like I've never went to school. But even when I went to school, it was a private school. It wasn't, like I said, there were no schools of that religious group. By now they have their own schools, but back then they didn't. So and since public schools were demonized, she at least sent me to another private school, a private school that again emphasizes spirituality a lot, and they also gotten some criticism, and the teachers knew what was going on. They saw that, but they didn't help me. And I spoke with one of my teachers lately, like after 20 years, and he explained what was going on, and he just blatantly explained to me that he was actually told that if they see abuse, even sexual abuse, if they see that some of the children who go to that school are sexually abused by their parents or whoever, they were specifically told not to report that to the authorities. And the reason was that was a private school, and I'm not going to say what school it was. That's not important, But it was a private school that faced a lot of criticism in the past, precisely because people were already concerned for the well-being of the children there. So they were like, well, if that comes out, then that's just gonna make us look even worse. And that was kind of the reaction of everyone, no matter if it was the school or if it was the religious community or if it was the village, wherever I was. People didn't want something like that to come out anyway because they felt it would make their village or their religion or their school or their whatever look bad.
That is, to me, I mean, I'm just going to be honest, to me, that's just sickening. How, because you're worried, you're so worried about your organization that you're tied up to, you're so worried of the name being tainted that you're not, as a human being, when you see something that is morally wrong like that, it, to me, I feel obligated to step in and do something, whatever it is. I mean, I don't care if the authority is telling me not to do it. Some things I'm going to go ahead and cross the line no matter what, especially when it's having to do with that. Because to me, when I hear that kind of stuff, it's sickening that people are willing to override any kind of safety, security, love, something to do with a child. You're going to override all of that because of fear that your organization or your club, the name is going to be tainted or you're going to lose your job. That if that's the case, it's like I don't want any kind of relation to that organization anyways. If they're related or they're tied up in that kind of sickness. And that's just my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, but in reality, that's how a lot of people act, especially, especially in communities where the community is emphasized a lot. That's kind of the downside of that. That they might see it as solidarity, solidarity towards the other members to not make them look bad. But that's kind of the downside of it, right?
Yeah. Like what was the final breaking point to where you decided to, because that was a young age. You left at fifth. That is very young to, did you step out on your own? You just left and got completely lost and separated yourself from them?
Yeah, I was both. I was separating myself. Well, actually, I started by, well, it was sort of at the same time, but well, the one kind of goes with the other, right? I was separating myself both from my mother and from the religious group. Though I first started with separating myself from the religious group. And then from my mother, because she was, I mean, at that time I was like about how old was I? Yeah, about 12 or 13. And then my mother moved away from the compound. So when I went away from my mother at 15, we were already no longer living at that compound. She was still kind of into it, she was into that ideology. And I don't know if that ideology and that belief is good or bad. I'm not going to pass judgment, but I just felt it necessary to get away from all of that at that time, and especially, of course, get away from my mother. The way I did that, well, originally my plan was to, just get help from the authorities, get help maybe from my grandparents. They were one of the few people who believed me. But again, basically because of solidarity to my mother, they didn't help me. So then I tried getting help from my teachers at school, because at that time I was going to school. But I just told you how that went. And then as a last resort, I simply tried calling the police. That didn't work either, because they, I explained a little. They didn't believe me because they, I had their full attention until the moment they realized my accusation wasn't against my father but against my mother. And they couldn't, at that time they couldn't really believe that, so they didn't take me seriously. So I was left with no option, or at least I felt I had no option, and I didn't get any help from anybody. At least that's how I felt at that time. So I didn't see any other option than to run away by my own. And the way I did that, now that I think about it, was actually pretty clever, because of course, eventually, there were some troubles, and eventually I did end up on the street. But at least initially, of course, the plan wasn't to end up on the street, right? And at least initially that worked. I didn't end up on the street, at least initially. And the way I did that was simply, simply to confront my mother, and simply, tell her that either you pay for my own apartment, or I'm gonna tell the authorities everything I know. And the next day I had my own apartment and she paid for it. At least, the first few months, and then I was sort of on my own. But yeah,
And how old were you?
15.
15 when that happened. And were you still in Germany or did you?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. But we moved away to the north of Germany at that time.
Was your father ever did like I know you said there were times when your mother was kind to avoid him, but was he? Did you ever know of times where he was trying to reach out to you? Like, did you hear from him in any
Oh
kind
yeah,
of?
yeah. He always tried to have contact with me, and of course I wanted to have contact with him. But in a way, that whole thing kind of helped my mother to keep my father away because everyone could see that. Well, frankly, everyone could see that I was being abused. So everyone just kind of assumed it was my father that did that, even though I've never seen him. So that kind of helped my mother to convince the authorities to not allow him to see me.
Oh, understand. Yeah. How long did the abuse go on for?
How much do you want to get into that? Because, like I said, if you want to put that on YouTube, then I might better avoid
Yeah. No,
certain specifics.
this isn't going on YouTube, but just like I mean, it's really, like I told you before, I'm not trying to press anything. It's what you come
No,
yeah,
it's
it's what
fine. I can talk about it now. It's fine. I can talk about it now. I couldn't, in the beginning, I couldn't talk. If we would have had that talk like 10 years ago, I would just freeze and I wouldn't be able to talk about it. But obviously, I talk to psychologists by now, and I'm now stable enough to talk about it. And the reason was also that a lot of initially, I just how do you say this in English? I've repressed everything,
yes.
especially since I didn't since starting with 15 I didn't really have anyone to take care of me, and my mother only paid the rent initially, and then I had to figure out how to pay the rent myself, which I couldn't always do. So I had to figure out ways to make money and to get a job. Even at a young age, I needed a job, obviously, but it was very difficult for me to get a job because I was at a job interview. I would always be very nervous, and I would always mess it up, and I would be socially awkward, and I wouldn't know why. And that went on for a long time. It was a real struggle for me, and I was like, wow, why is this happening? Why can't I get a job? Why am I so socially
Yeah.
awkward? And then I figured, well, maybe it's because of all the sexual abuse that I've been repressing for 20 years. Maybe that might have something to do with that. So that's then when I started to talk to psychologists and get help. So now I can talk about it. Initially, like I said, everything kind of has to do with the initial abortion that my mother had, and that that just messed her up because, like I said, she was forced to and she didn't want to, and that just messed her up completely. And she was probably also abused by her boyfriend. I don't know that for sure, but it from what she told me, it sounds like it. So anyway, she was really traumatized, and she started to hate men and started to blame men for everything basically. And then of course that presented a sort of a problem for her, because she didn't want to have an abortion again, right? The whole point was to not have an abortion again. But what is she going to do if the child she has turns out to be male? She's going to have a problem with that, and she did have a problem with that. But then again, she can't get an abortion again because the whole point was to not have an abortion, right? So that was a bit of a problem for her because she really, really, really wanted and needed a girl, because she was afraid of men and she hated men for what they have done to her. Even though it's not like man did that. It's specific man that did that, but she blamed it on all men, right? so she figured, like I said, at least back then, that religious group was kind of like a commune. And even though it builds itself as a Christian religious group, there are actually a lot of leftist ideology that's in there. I mean, they also have some extreme right wing stuff, but anyway, the point is, my mother was also very much a communist, and she was actually, back when East Germany was still around, and so she actually had a lot of connections to that as well. So she wasn't just a normal communist party member, but how do you say that? Like a communist official, basically. So she was very much indoctrinated with that kind of ideology as well. And one aspect of that they teach you in like Marxism 101 is that there is nothing that is inborn. Basically, we are a product. That's like a leftist teaching, right? We are a product of our environment, like completely. There's nothing inborn. So she believed that. So she figured, well, if she just raises me as a girl, then because gender in her mind is a societal construct, as long as she just simply raises me as a girl, I will magically become a girl. I mean, obviously, I'm not gonna have the parts, but other than that, I'm gonna behave just like a girl, and it's gonna be fine. So she actually raised me as a girl, or at least she tried to raise me as a girl, because I didn't like that at all. But that's how everything basically started, because I refused to be a girl. I didn't want that. So she started punishing me for that, and she had to beat me. She had to use. That's when she started using physical violence, because that was the only way to get me to act like a girl. Because I didn't want that, and unless she used physical violence, there was no way she was gonna get me to behave like that. So at that point, she had to use physical violence, at least in her mind. So, and then also the sexual abuse started as well, because the moment I refused to become a girl, that was what made it possible for her to do that stuff to me, because then I wasn't a child anymore. I wasn't an innocent child. I was a man. I was part of the group that did all these terrible things to her, at least in her mind, because she wasn't really able to differentiate between individuals in a group, because that's what she believed. She was judging everyone based on their group, not on the individual. So the moment I refused to be a girl, she started to also sexually abuse me.
Man, it seems like you have nowadays a very good understanding of the psychological warfare, or what was going on in her mind and her way of thinking, especially with her ideology, to make, I don't want to say make sense, but for her to be able to do what she was doing and not feel anything about it, or not, have a conscience for it. Because like you said, in her reality, you were now the enemy or somebody that she despises. So why should I feel sorry or bad for doing this? Never mind that it's her own child. When you were talking about everything that having to do with like what she was trying to do from a young age, and that was trying to put you in girl clothes and girl get up, and maybe I'll change him this way. But I was wondering, when you were part of the communities, because a lot of times like-minded people, they tend to like being around each other, and you always, I don't want to call it, well, I guess you could say like you're in an echo chamber. Sometimes you just want to be around people that think like you, that speak like you, and anything that's challenging that, it could be uncomfortable. So you'd rather stick to your own. In some of those communities, they have the same ideologies. So I was wondering, when you were younger and you were going through these terrible things with your mother, if you had met any kids or anybody that may have hinted to them having things done to them, or having their mother or their father acting a certain way towards them, abuse or any kind of sufferings to that extent.
You mean at that time when we were living in that religious community?
Yes.
No, and I'm not. I want to make that clear, because I don't want to offend these people too much. I'm not accusing them of sexually abusing me. I'm just accusing my mother. So I'm not saying that I don't. At the end of the day, yes, I was trying to make sense of it, but at the end of the day, I don't know for certain why. So I'm certainly not saying that it was because of the religious group. I don't know. I honestly don't know, and I don't know if other things like that happened with other people in that religious group. I honestly don't know because now I've thought about what happened a lot, and try to understand and make sense of it all. It was very important to me to be able to overcome all that. That was very important to understand why. That was very important to me because if you experience something like that initially, and the perpetrator will actually want that. The perpetrator will want you to blame yourself, even though obviously that's complete rubbish, and obviously it's not the fault of the child when something like that is done to them. But a child doesn't understand that, and at that time I didn't understand that. So for a long time I was blaming myself, right? So it was very important for me to actually understand what was going on, and that's why I tried to make sense of it all, right? But back then I didn't yet have that ability, so I wouldn't have been, even if there might have been other children you know with similar circumstances. I wouldn't at that time I wouldn't have been able to recognize it.
How were you able to make ends meet at such a young age? Because I don't know how it is in Germany, but isn't there were you working jobs under the table, just odd jobs so you can survive during that time? Because you're 15 years old and left to fend for yourself.
It was difficult because normally, if you get help from the authorities, you basically get provided everything. But since that wasn't the case for me, yeah, I was basically working odd jobs, so to say. I didn't have much money, and but I also was able to save a lot of money because because back then it was easier to well, for example, nowadays you live in Germany yourself, right? And so you know how it is, right? So of course, Germany is great. Germany has universal healthcare
Yeah.
and free healthcare that obviously you have to pay for. So it's not really free healthcare, but
But-
how it is. Everyone is forced,
yeah.
for example, to pay healthcare, even if they're not getting any benefits from that. But back then, it was, for example, still possible to not do that. So I simply wasn't paying healthcare. I wasn't, I was still young, so I wasn't really getting sick. So I just, that was one way I saved money. Is just simply not pay for healthcare and not having healthcare either, which probably was a bad idea, but it worked out fine. So yeah. so so I was trying to save as much money as
Yeah.
possible, and do odd jobs and do whatever. I was always trying to get jobs, and I took whatever jobs I was able to get. Most of the jobs I didn't get because I was still so socially awkward, because that whole experience left me very socially awkward. Yeah.
That's what I was going to ask you also because of all of the failed attempts for you to get help. I mean, how were you feeling towards people at that point in your life? Did you feel like you couldn't trust anybody? Anyways, like you said, you were socially awkward, but I mean, did you feel like you would rather keep to yourself because of a lack of trust and confidence in people being there for you when you felt like you would need them or you needed them in your life?
I felt that there was something wrong with me, and that's very typical. That's with basically everyone that was sexually abused as a child. They're gonna blame themselves, at least initially, right? Or at least as long as they don't get help, which is why it's important to get professional help and to talk to a psychologist. And as long as they don't do that, then they usually aren't able to break out of that, and they're stuck with blaming themselves. And of course that's painful, because the whole memory is painful, and then on top of that you blame yourself for all the terrible things that have happened. And that's what leads people to simply repress all these memories. And repressing the memories doesn't mean that you can't remember anymore. It just means that you don't want to remember because it's painful. And on top of it being painful, you blame yourself for all of that, right? So it's really important to talk to a psychologist. And it's only when I started to do that that I was able to break out of all of that.
Can you remember that time or that point when you took that step to try to seek help and figure out how you can better your condition and work towards some type of healing and recovery for everything that happened in the past?
Mm, um, well, I think the turning point is that I've watched. I like for some weird reason. Oh, actually, I know why. I don't know if you may have time to get into that. I really like horror movies. And the reason why is because when I was 4 years old, my mother watched Alien with me. That I think that was the first time it was shown on TV. The original Alien movie, and she was scared to watch it alone, and so she thought it was a good idea to have her little child watch it with her. And it, of course, it completely traumatized me. And it was horrible. I had nightmares for weeks, but after the nightmares went away, I noticed something, and I noticed something in that movie. Other than it being a scary movie, it's also because actually Alien is about sexual abuse, and Ripley, in a way, is a survivor. Of course, back then I didn't understand that consciously, but I understood it subconsciously. It gave me hope in a way because she was able to overcome all that. She suffered all this horrible abuse because everything in Alien is symbolic about for sexual abuse. And I didn't know that as a child, but I noticed it subconsciously, and I noticed that at the end of the day, she was able to survive all that and to overcome all that, and that gave me tremendous hope. So that's why I like horror movies. And I was watching a similar psychological horror movie, and there was a scene in that where the protagonist of that movie was talking about his childhood and how he was sexually abused, and how he was blaming himself for that. And then the psychologist says to him that that's complete rubbish. That obviously it's not the fault of a small child when it gets sexually abused. And I watched that, and obviously, at that point I understood. Oh, oh, and that's when I got help.
Whoa. How you spoke of aliens. Now I feel like I would have to rewatch it with that in mind, because in your reference you're saying that that's a metaphor for sexual abuse, that whole movie. And the that's crazy. In a subconscious level, who knows? The creator, the director, maybe in a subconscious level had that on mind. But of course, sometimes you want to do things in a more subtle way and you use symbols or you use characters, but you're really referring to something else. In his creating it, subconsciously, his thoughts and all that, they're put out into the ether. And then, boom, you as a child, you connected with that, even though you didn't know it at the time, like you said, in a conscious level, but subconsciously there was something there that was making complete sense to you and hitting home in a different way. Wow.
Right, right. Everyone notices it subconsciously, and that's what makes it scary. Yeah.
Now, one thing that really strikes me is all, and we could only we only have time to talk about so much, but I mean, I can't even begin to imagine the stuff you had to go through. And but the thing that strikes me out of all of this is how you still seem upbeat. You know, you seem chipper. You seem friendly. You said you were socially awkward at one time, but I mean, you seem like you're loose and you're easygoing. Like it's so good to see
The
that.
thing is, when you've been traumatized, it never goes away completely. If you work on yourself, you can make it go away to a certain extent, and to the extent that you're able to live a normal life and be happy. You can do that, and you can live a normal happy life if you work on yourself. But yeah, of course it always it's always kind of there. It's like I don't know how to describe that. Maybe a kind of subconscious fear, because you've been traumatized, you're always kind of afraid of that happening again, and that fear never goes away completely. But you can get to the point where you control the fear instead of the fear controlling you.
Oh, that's powerful. Years have passed, so like throughout this time, what has been some things that you've worked out or like tools that you use to help with the healing?
The only thing that's left to talk about, and that I intentionally didn't mention, and that I usually don't mention because it's very personal, and especially if we're talking about such religious groups. And it's also, especially nowadays with all these horrible things happening, even in the Catholic Church, you have like priests abusing altar boys, and that was also, I mean, that was also a huge thing that a religious group I grew up with was criticizing about the Catholic Church, right? So it's come to a point where religion has almost gotten a bad name, and it's something bad. And in a way, even though religion isn't the same as faith, and it isn't the same as God, right? People have difficulty distinguishing between that. So when they see like a Catholic priest abusing an altar boy, they, in a way, they kind of blame God for that, even though obviously it's not God's fault, right? And that's kind of one of the things that was very important for me to learn, was not to blame someone else, right? Because you always tend to do that, right? When something terrible like that happens, right? You say, "Oh, it's my own fault for having been sexually abused at like 5 years old." How is that your own fault? That's not your own fault. And if they don't say, "Oh, it's my own fault," they say, "Oh, it's God's fault." How is it God's fault exactly? I mean, shouldn't it just be the fault of the perpetrator? It's the fault of the perpetrator, isn't it? I mean, right? So that's very important. And so it was very important for me to realize that as well, because of all these bad experiences. And initially, I was also like feeling like, oh, in a way, I was also blaming God, and I didn't have any faith. But then I realized that just because some religions mess up, that doesn't mean it's God's fault. And so for me, it was also important to have my own faith and my own faith in God, and not necessarily having any religious community. I always try to separate that. And in German, you say, well, you say the same as in English. Actually, you say religious community, so or faith community. No, in German you say faith community, Glaubensgemeinschaft. So a lot of people focus on the community, but not on the faith. But you can have faith without the community. What do you need a community of humans for? You can just have your own faith in God. You don't need the community aspect. So that was something that for me personally was important, was to regain my faith in God.
Mm. Oh, yeah. Yeah, everybody has their own journey, and you're right. You're right that we can, the same way we can generalize one person wronging us, and then now it's everybody. Like how you said, for one thing, your mother, because of what one man did, and then now it was all men are the enemy. And the same thing, like if it has to do with, it could be a religious group or something, and then now anything that religious group represents, including God, I want no part of it. But that could definitely be the wrong way to go about it. I'm curious, what's become of your mother and your father? Is there no contact at all with them these
Mm,
days?
I have contact with my father now. Now I not now, now that my mother doesn't interfere with it anymore. I'm able to have contact with my father, and I have contact with my father, and well, I like him. Nothing wrong with him. Obviously, it was very difficult for both of us,
Right.
and there were some aspects that neither of us knew how to deal with back then. But other than that, he's a normal, nice guy, and I like him, kind of. Yeah. It's a shame that he never had the opportunity to really be my father. I mean, to actually be there for me.
Yeah.
But it's not his fault. It's not his fault. And my mother, well, after I ran away. So initially, the first couple of years after I ran away, I blocked contact with her completely, and that was important to me at that time. I just needed to get away from everything. It was too traumatic. I just needed some distance, and so the first couple of years, I didn't have any contact with her. And then after that, after I had some breathing space, I tried approaching her again to just have a normal relationship, despite all that happened. Just have a normal relationship now. But that was never possible. She always felt, how do you say this in English? She always started to behave in the same patterns, and she was unable to break out of that. How should I explain this? It's like, because of this whole Disney thing, the word grooming has almost, people don't take it serious. It's like they make fun of it, but it's actually a very serious thing, and it's a horrible thing, that exists. That there is grooming, and there are predators out there that use these kinds of tactics to manipulate their victims. It's a very serious issue, but people nowadays don't take it serious anymore. But it's a very serious thing, and it exists, and that's what my mother actually used, and what she did with me. And I don't think
Hmm.
she did that consciously. It's not like she went on the internet. I mean, besides there not being an internet back then, it's not like she went on the internet and looked up, oh, how do you groom someone, and oh, what are the 5 stages of grooming or whatever, and then she just went by them. She didn't do that consciously, but she sort of did that automatically, because those are simply the most effective ways for a pedophile. Beep that word if you can't say that.
Right. Yeah. A pedophile is a pedophile. There's nothing to blurb out.
But those are the most effective ways for a pedophile to manipulate his victim. And she was unable to break out of that pattern. So it was not possible for me to have a normal relationship with her.
I assume after that, the door is shut. And yeah, what can you do?
Yeah, well, actually, she just, well, last year I got a call because I didn't have any contact with her for like many, many years, for decades, actually. So now I kind of regret that. At least after the first decade or so, I should have tried having contact with her again. I mean, like I said, I did try to have contact with her, and it just didn't work. But still, now I feel that maybe I should have tried harder, because last year I got a call from someone that I knew from my childhood, and she told me that my mother had passed away, and I didn't even know she wasn't that old. She was 66, I think. Yeah, I think she was. around 66. She wasn't old. I didn't expect her to die that soon. I was always hoping that someday it would be possible for me to have a normal conversation with her and maybe to talk about all that. Yeah, and so that came kind of suddenly because I kept my distance and I needed distance, but that also meant that no one was telling me about her, and no one was telling me that she was sick. I didn't know that she was sick at all. And I feel, obviously they should have. They knew that I needed distance and I didn't want to talk to her, but still, they should have realized that if she's sick, then they should have told me about that. So it turns out she was sick for a long time, and then she died. And
Mm.
yeah,
So it seemed like even despite everything, you still had. Is it fair to say you still had love for her in a sense?
well, definitely not the kind of love that she wanted from me.
Yeah.
So no, not that kind of love, because that wasn't the appropriate kind of love. But obviously, I felt very sad. I did. I mean, initially I didn't know how to deal with it, but after having heard all the circumstances and having heard about her being sick, I of course feel very sorry for her, and I feel sorry that we were never able to really talk about all that happened. And to maybe I was always hoping that someday it would be possible to have a normal conversation with her, and maybe have a normal relationship with her, and to move past all that has happened.
Man, you have a very forgiving heart. Some people it's hard to let go of things. And then if they're wronged or if they've gone through certain things in their life, sometimes they're wishing the worst for their perpetrator. But you, on the other hand, you had a different heart towards that. This was your mother, but you still wanted to try to see if there was a way you can resolve some of the things, or just maybe find some kind of clarity as to it, or like you said, work past it, or forgiving your perpetrator. Without forgiving, there's not going to be any road to you starting to heal and work past the trauma that you've been dealt. So,
Yeah, actually, that's precisely the aspect where me reestablishing my own faith in God was important, was invaluable actually. And even from a materialistic or atheist point of view, that actually helps a lot. Even if you might not believe in God, you got to admit that if someone believes in God and believes that eventually God will judge people, it helps them not to judge people by themselves, right? Not to and not to seek revenge. I don't need to seek revenge, because I believe God will judge people.
we spoke like this was one of those things that came up at the spur of the moment for me connecting with you, and then you having time and space today to share your story. And this, I knew a little bit of what was going on before we started to have this conversation online. But I commend you for being open and willing to share this with us today. And I know you're involved with a few things, right? I mean, like, say if people listening would like to reach out to you, they'd like to, shoot a message, say hello, or just see what you're involved with. Is there anywhere or any place that they could find you online or offline?
Well, yeah, like we already mentioned, I have a YouTube channel that I haven't uploaded to in a while, but still, people can go there if they want to. Just search for The last name is actually not my real name. I just got it from 1984. It's the antagonist in 1984, the enemy of Big Brother, Emmanuel Goldstein. That's how you would pronounce it in German, anyway. So anyway, just go on YouTube, search for Emmanuel Goldstein, and you'll find my channel.
Cool. I'm gonna leave that all of that information in the show notes so people can look you up if they so please. In 1984, that is one of my favorites. I've read it
Yeah,
once, I've read it
mine too,
again,
mine
and
too.
I'm probably gonna read it a third time sometime. But I have that book, and oh my goodness. What's the old saying? There was like a meme made out of it. It's like 1984.
Wasn't supposed to be an instruction manual.
There you go. Yeah. You knew exactly where I was going with that one. Oh man. And 2 plus 2 does not equal.
Equals 5. Equals 5. Yes. If the party tells you it equals 5, then it does.
Man, this has been even though you shared a lot. Like you said, you were asking me, what are you comfortable with me sharing? I'm like, just let it rip. I can go ahead and set a disclaimer beforehand. I'm not going to censor anybody, and I'm not going to say no, this is off limits. Like, no, you go ahead and speak your piece, and let the people decide. We're all grown adults here. We had a good run. I feel like I really like your attitude. I appreciate your way of looking at things in life. I really that really I hear this, and it's refreshing to hear from me. And even though despite all of the that you've been through, but you're still pushing, you're still fighting, and that's really what this show is about. It's about highlighting stories of people that we all have our struggles. We all started from different places, and we all been through different things. Not to say this person is worse, or no, you don't understand. I mean, of course, our experiences are unique and they're different, but the other point is that people have also found ways to overcome it. They found ways to work on the recovery towards healing and living. Like you said, there's some things you're not going to wipe it out completely, but you can still find a way to live a productive and meaningful life, like you've done, and that you're continuing to do. So that's a beautiful thing to hear, and these are the type of stories that I so much appreciate and love to share. So, with that being said, is there anything else you'd like to leave the listeners off with before we wrap this thing up?
Ich glaube, das war ein sehr gutes Schlusswort. I believe that was a good way of summarizing and ending it.
Richtig. Okay, Emmanuel. I know I'm saying it wrong again.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Everyone says it differently.
It's got a different charm for everybody, right? Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you again.
Thank you.
Forgiveness. That was a big part of Emmanuel's healing process. To be able to forgive somebody who abused him, who robbed him of his childhood, who did all these terrible things to him, his own mother. But years later, he was able to come to terms with forgiving her, trying to reach out to her in the hopes of maybe making amends and getting past that and possibly even building something, or at least talking about what happened. That in itself takes courage. He credits his faith in God, his faith that helped him along the way. But forgiveness, how many of us struggle with that? Forgiving ourselves, forgiving those that have stepped on our toes and did us wrong, those that have burned us in the past. It's hard to forgive. But that grudge that we hold on to, that resentment, it could be like a ball and chain in our ankle and tie us down. So his message of forgiveness, that spoke to me too. And also let the words echo that came from Emmanuel about anybody who's been a victim of any type of abuse. Don't blame yourself. It's not your fault. Don't blame yourself. He struggled with that, and so many others struggle with that. Blaming themselves, holding themselves responsible for the wrong that happened to them. But the only one who should be held responsible for that is the perpetrator, not you. Emmanuel, for everything that you've been through, everything that you pushed through, you found your way. You found healing, you found growth, you found maturity, and you're in a better place now because of it. There's no doubt. You are a giant amongst us. I want to thank you for sharing your words and sharing your story with us. It was a spur-of-the-moment thing. I spoke with him that day, and he said he was available right then and there, so we did it on the spot. Not really on the spot, but about an hour and two after our first message. So he was game, and he was really interested in sharing his story, so thank you. My hat's off to you. All the best. I'll leave all of his information in the description box in the show notes, so anybody listening to his story and they want to check him out, check out his YouTube, or get in contact with him and just send him a line to let him know. Thank you for sharing your words. And thank you to everybody listening. I see now that there's people from China, Russia, Sweden, Denmark, Ireland, New Zealand, Brazil. We've got people from Germany, of course, the US, from all over. So thank you to everybody that has been tuned in and everyone that has been a part of the show. And you can always check out the website. You can leave a comment, some feedback on any one of the shows and episodes that you listened to and that spoke to you and that you appreciated. And you can also leave a message, and if you like, I can share that message on one of the up-and-coming episodes and give you a shout out, because I do appreciate everybody that has been a part of this show and a part of this experience. Share it with someone you think who might find value in it. And before I go, if you like to be a part of the show and share your story, or even a story of someone in your life that has impacted you in a positive way, you could always reach out to me via email. I'd be happy to connect. Until next time, and very soon. Peace.
Looking for a sign to know I'm on the right road. Ain't seen no sign since Jericho.